Fleet Marshal Osvin Threll had accepted the surrender of 11 allied species within the first 6 hours of the Kryvath Compact's ultimatum, watching civilization after civilization lay down its weapons the moment his armada's true scale became undeniable. Humanity received the same ultimatum, delivered simultaneously, translated flawlessly, backed by the same overwhelming fleet. Humanity's formal surrender arrived 72 hours later, and by the time it did, 4 of his warships were smoking wrecks in Earth's upper atmosphere, and Osvin Threll no longer understood what kind of war he had actually started. The Kryvath Compact's conquest doctrine, refined across 200 years of expansion, had always operated on a simple, reliable premise. Overwhelming force, demonstrated decisively and without hesitation, produced rapid capitulation from any species with a functioning survival instinct. The Compact's opening strategy against any new target civilization involved a single, devastating display, an unmistakable demonstration of fleet capability sufficient to convince even the most stubborn resistance movement that further conflict served no purpose beyond needless casualties. It had worked against the Varathi. It had worked against the Asaki Concordat. It had worked, within hours, against 11 separate species during this exact campaign, each one recognizing, with the particular clarity that overwhelming force reliably produced, that survival required immediate acceptance of terms. Earth's response arrived through the same open diplomatic channel every other species had used to formally surrender. "We received your terms. We will not be accepting them today." Fleet Marshal Threll reviewed the message with genuine confusion, assuming, initially, some translation error had garbled what should have been a straightforward capitulation. His communications officer confirmed the translation was accurate, word for word, deliberate. "They understand the fleet's capability," Threll said, reviewing sensor data that showed Earth's entire visible military presence, a scattering of orbital defense platforms, and a modest planetary fleet that his own tactical analysis assessed as capable of resisting his armada for, at absolute maximum, several hours. Every other species that received this ultimatum understood immediately that resistance served no purpose. Explain why humanity's response differs. "I cannot yet explain it, Marshal," his intelligence officer admitted. Their formal reply included no counterterms, no negotiation attempt, no indication they believe resistance carries any realistic prospect of altering the eventual outcome. They appear to understand precisely what our fleet represents and have chosen resistance regardless. Threll ordered a limited demonstration strike against one of Earth's orbital defense platforms, expecting, based on 200 years of successful conquest doctrine, that the visible destruction of even a modest human military asset would produce exactly the kind of immediate reassessment every previous target species had reliably demonstrated once actual combat, rather than theoretical threat, entered the equation. The platform's defensive response, when his strike group approached, was not the desperate, uncoordinated resistance his considerable experience had prepared him to expect from a hopelessly outmatched defender. It was calculated, precise, and cost him 2 support vessels before his forces successfully destroyed the installation. A casualty ratio his own doctrine's historical archive showed no comparable precedent for against any species this technologically outmatched. This is not the behavior of a species attempting to negotiate better surrender terms through token resistance, his tactical officer reported, reviewing the engagement's data with genuine professional unease. This is the behavior of a species that has already calculated the cost of continued resistance, accepted that cost, and committed to paying it regardless of the eventual outcome. Fleet Marshal Threll requested, through the same open channel, direct communication with Earth's command authority, genuinely uncertain, for the first time in a considerable military career, how to properly interpret a target civilization's tactical decision-making. General Maria Castellan, coordinating Earth's unified planetary defense from a command bunker that compact reconnaissance had, with mounting alarm, only partially mapped, accepted the communication request with the same unhurried calm that had characterized every previous human response. "Fleet Marshal Threll," she said, her translated voice carrying no apparent distress despite the destruction his forces had already inflicted. "I understand you're confused about our response. I'll try to explain it plainly, since I don't think prolonging that confusion serves either of us particularly well. Your species faces certain, comprehensive defeat," Threll said. 11 other civilizations, several possessing military capability comparable to or exceeding your own, accepted this reality within hours of receiving equivalent terms. Your continued resistance produces only additional, unnecessary casualties among your own population, without any realistic prospect of altering the campaign's ultimate outcome. I request clarification regarding your government's strategic reasoning. "We know we're going to lose this fight, Fleet Marshal," General Castellan said. "I want to be completely clear about that because I don't think there's any value in pretending otherwise to you or to my own people. Your fleet outmatches anything we can put against it. We ran those numbers before your ultimatum even finished transmitting, and every serious military analyst we have came to the same conclusion within the first hour. We are not fighting because we believe we can win this war." "Then your resistance serves no strategic purpose," Threll said. "It serves a purpose you don't currently have a framework for understanding, but I think you will before this is over," General Castellan said. "We're not fighting for 3 days because we think we can beat your fleet. We're fighting for 3 days because every single time a group of people has ever come to conquer us, throughout our entire history, the terms they eventually offered us were shaped, directly and specifically, by how much it actually cost them to get us to accept those terms. Nobody who conquered a people that surrendered without resistance ever treated that population as well as they treated the ones who made the conquest expensive. We know exactly what happens to species that fold the moment they're asked to, Fleet Marshal. We've watched it happen to our own people more times than I'd like to count, across our own history. We're not fighting to win. We're fighting to make sure that whatever terms you eventually impose on us, you impose knowing exactly what it costs to make us accept them." Fleet Marshal Threll found himself, for the first time in 200 years of compact conquest doctrine, his own considerable career had faithfully executed, confronting a strategic calculation his species' entire military tradition had never previously needed to develop language for. "You are fighting," he said slowly, "not to prevent defeat, but to shape the terms of a defeat you have already accepted as inevitable." "That's most of it, yes," General Castellan said. "Though I want to add something else, because I think it matters and I don't want you walking away from this conversation with an incomplete picture. We're also fighting because there's a difference, a real, meaningful difference, between a species that surrenders because resistance is genuinely pointless, and a species that surrenders because it never tried to find out. Every person in this fight right now knows we're not winning. But every person in this fight also knows that when this is over, whatever happens next, we'll know we made you work for it. That matters to us, Fleet Marshal, in ways I don't think your doctrine has ever needed to account for, because I'd guess every other species that surrendered to you today calculated the cost of resistance purely in terms of casualties versus outcome. We're calculating something else too. We're calculating what kind of people we want to be able to look at each other and say we were, after this is finished, regardless of how it ends." The following 72 hours, documented extensively in compact military records that would eventually become required study across an entire generation of Krivath strategic planning, proceeded in a manner Fleet Marshal Threll's considerable prior conquest experience had never once prepared him to anticipate. Human resistance forces, fully aware of their overwhelming numerical and technological disadvantage, fought with a coordinated, disciplined intensity that inflicted casualties on compact forces at a rate his own historical archive showed no precedent for against any comparably outmatched adversary. They did not fight recklessly, hopping against calculable odds for some unexpected reversal. They fought with the specific, deliberate precision of a force that understood exactly what it could and could not achieve, and had committed, with full clarity about the eventual outcome, to extracting the maximum possible cost from an enemy they knew they could not ultimately defeat. They are not fighting as though they expect to win, his tactical officer reported, 60 hours into an engagement that had already cost the compact considerably more in ships and personnel than the entirety of their previous 11 planetary conquests combined. They are fighting as though winning was never the actual objective. Every engagement suggests a species specifically calculating how to inflict maximum verifiable cost on our forces within a resistance period they appear to have predetermined in advance, rather than continuing indefinitely toward some hoped-for strategic reversal. Fleet Marshal Threll requested, 48 hours into the engagement, a second direct communication with General Castellan, genuinely attempting, for reasons his own considerable career had never previously required him to examine, to understand a strategic philosophy his species' 200 years of successful conquest doctrine had simply never needed to develop. "Your casualties are severe," he said. "Your resistance has cost us considerably more than any previous campaign in compact history, and yet your own losses, proportionally, exceed anything a rational strategic calculation would accept for a resistance effort your own command explicitly acknowledged from the outset, could not alter the eventual outcome. I genuinely wish to understand this decision, General Castellan, not as a tactical curiosity, but because I have begun to suspect my own doctrine has fundamentally misunderstood something about your species that considerable prior conquest experience never required us to examine. I appreciate you actually asking instead of just cataloging us as an anomaly, Fleet Marshal," General Castellan said, her voice carrying, for the first time in their exchanges, genuine exhaustion beneath its continued composure. "I'll try to give you the honest version because I think you've earned it at this point, given what this has cost both of us. Every civilization that's ever conquered another group of people, throughout our own long, complicated history, has always treated the people who fought back differently than the people who didn't. Sometimes that's meant harsher treatment, brutal reprisal for the cost of resistance, but more often, across enough different examples throughout our history that we built an entire strategic doctrine around it, it's meant something else. It's meant the conquering power eventually deciding that a population expensive enough to subjugate is also a population worth negotiating with, rather than simply exploiting outright. We don't know yet which kind of conqueror you're going to turn out to be, Fleet Marshal, but we made a decision, before your fleet ever arrived in our system, that whichever kind you turned out to be, you were going to make that decision knowing exactly what kind of people you were choosing to become the ruler of. We didn't want you deciding our fate based on a fantasy where we rolled over the moment your ships appeared. We wanted you deciding it after 3 days of knowing, in very real, very costly terms, precisely who you were actually dealing with. Humanity's formal surrender, submitted precisely 72 hours after the original ultimatum, contained terms that Fleet Marshal Threll's own considerable diplomatic staff would spend considerable time afterward attempting to properly contextualize, given the unprecedented cost the preceding 3 days had extracted from compact forces. "We accept your terms of occupation," the formal surrender document read, "with the following conditions, which we trust the preceding 72 hours have adequately demonstrated we are prepared to enforce through whatever additional cost proves necessary, should those conditions prove unacceptable to your command." The conditions, considerably more extensive and more favorable to Earth's civilian population than any previous surrender terms the compact had negotiated with an outmatched adversary, included specific protections for human governance structures, guaranteed limits on resource extraction, and formal recognition of Earth's eventual right to petition for expanded autonomy following a defined transitional period. Fleet Marshal Threll's formal report to Compact High Command, submitted 3 weeks after the campaign's costly conclusion, represented a fundamental reconsideration of assumptions 200 years of successful conquest doctrine had never previously required him to examine. Our conquest doctrine has always operated on the assumption that overwhelming force, decisively demonstrated, produces rapid capitulation, and, subsequently, straightforward occupation terms dictated entirely by the conquering power's own strategic preference, he wrote. This assumption held across 11 simultaneous target civilizations during this exact campaign, each one surrendering within hours and accepting whatever terms our command subsequently determined appropriate. Humanity's response fundamentally inverted this pattern, not through any realistic prospect of military victory, which their own command explicitly acknowledged from the outset did not exist, but through a deliberate, calculated decision to make their eventual, inevitable defeat cost considerably more than any comparable campaign in our recorded conquest history, specifically in order to shape the terms of that defeat, rather than simply accept whatever terms we chose to impose. I do not believe this represents irrational resistance, however costly it proved for both sides. I believe it represents a strategic philosophy our doctrine has never previously encountered, one that treats the cost of conquest not as a variable to be minimized through rapid capitulation, but as a deliberate negotiating instrument, extracted specifically to influence how a superior force ultimately chooses to govern a population it cannot be prevented from conquering, but can be made to understand, in very concrete and costly terms, exactly what kind of population it has chosen to rule. He concluded his report with an observation that would become, within subsequent generations of Krivath strategic doctrine, one of the most extensively studied principles regarding conquered population management. We conquered humanity, counselors, in the narrow, technical sense that our overwhelming force ultimately compelled their formal surrender, he wrote. I do not believe, having personally negotiated the terms that surrender eventually required, that we conquered them in any sense our doctrine has previously understood that word to mean. Every other species within this campaign surrendered a population we were free to govern however our strategic preference eventually determined. Humanity surrendered a population whose 3 days of costly, deliberate resistance ensured we would govern them only under terms considerably more constrained, considerably more accountable, and considerably more expensive to violate than any occupation doctrine we have previously implemented. They did not fight to win, counselors. They fought to ensure that whatever we won, we would understand precisely what it had actually cost us to take it. And I believe, having watched the full 72 hours unfold, that this distinction may prove considerably more strategically significant than any conventional military victory could have provided them. General Maria Castellan, addressing a gathering of surviving resistance commanders in the days following the formal surrender's conclusion, offered a final assessment that would become, within human military academies studying the campaign in the years that followed, the defining articulation of the strategic philosophy that had shaped humanity's unprecedented response. People are going to ask us, for years probably, why we fought a war we knew from the very first hour we couldn't win, she said, standing before commanders whose exhaustion carried the particular weight of people who had spent 3 days making an impossible fight matter anyway. I want every one of you to understand exactly why, because I think it's the most important thing we did during this entire war, more important, honestly, than any single tactical decision we made along the way. We fought because surrender without cost teaches a conqueror nothing about who they're actually conquering. It lets them write whatever story about you serves their own convenience, because You never gave them a reason to write anything else. We made sure over 3 days, at a cost every single person in this room is going to carry for the rest of their lives, that whoever governs us from this point forward does so having learned, in the most direct and undeniable way possible, exactly who we actually are. Not a species that rolled over the moment resistance stopped being winnable. A species that understood exactly what resistance would cost, and paid that cost anyway because we decided together that the terms of our defeat mattered considerably more than the terms of an easy, unearned surrender ever could have. We didn't win this war, but I promise you, every one of you, we shaped exactly what losing it was going to mean, and that's not nothing. That might, in the end, turn out to be the most important thing we ever did.